The first thing Jack saw wasn't Tu Tien, it was the way she avoided his eyes. He stood at the edge of the small dirt path leading into the village, his shoes still clean, his clothes still carrying the scent of the city he had just abandoned. But none of that mattered anymore because a few steps ahead, under the shade of a worn wooden roof, Tu Tien was kneeling beside a group of children, carefully tying a loose shoelace for one of them, her movements gentle, patient, and distant, like someone who had learned to live without expecting anything in return. And when their son ran past her laughing, his small voice echoing through the quiet afternoon, Jack felt something tighten in his chest because that laughter was still the same, still warm, still innocent, but it no longer belonged to a world where he was present every day. "Mama!" the boy shouted, running toward her, and she smiled, softly, naturally, the kind of smile Jack hadn't seen in so long, the kind of smile that used to be for him. And when she finally stood up and turned slightly, her gaze brushed past him for less than a second before moving away, as if he were nothing more than a stranger passing through. And that moment alone hit harder than any accusation she could have thrown at him, because it meant something far worse. She no longer expected him to be there. Jack took a step forward, then another, his voice catching slightly before he managed to say, "Tien." But she didn't respond. Not immediately. Not the way she used to. Instead, she picked up a basket of books and walked past him, close enough that he could feel the familiar warmth of her presence, but distant enough that it felt unreachable, and only when their son noticed him did the moment break. "Daddy!" The boy ran toward him without hesitation, small arms wrapping tightly around his leg, and Jack dropped to his knees instantly, holding him, pressing him close as if trying to make up for all the days he had been absent. "I missed you," he whispered, his voice unsteady, and the boy laughed softly, unaware of the weight behind those words. "You come late," the child said innocently, and Jack swallowed hard because even that simple sentence carried more truth than he deserved. When he looked up again, Tu Tien was standing a few steps away, watching them quietly, her expression unreadable, not angry, not cold, but no longer open. And for the first time, Jack realized that this wasn't going to be something he could fix with words. "Can I help?" he asked, standing slowly, his eyes searching hers for even the smallest sign of acceptance, but she simply turned away, handing books to the children. "They need notebooks more than help," she said calmly, her tone polite but distant, and that distance cut deeper than rejection, because it meant she had already placed him outside of her world. Jack nodded slightly, not arguing, not insisting, because he knew he didn't have the right. And instead of leaving, he stayed, picking up a stack of old chairs, carrying them closer to the group, fixing what he could without being asked. And the children watched him curiously, whispering among themselves, because to them he was new, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. The sun slowly dipped lower, casting warm light across the small yard, and for hours, Jack didn't stop moving, didn't stop helping, even when no one acknowledged him, even when Tu Tien never once looked his way again, because for the first time in his life, he understood that being present wasn't about being noticed. It was about choosing to stay, even when you weren't wanted. Days passed, and he kept coming back, every morning, every afternoon, carrying supplies, fixing broken desks, helping the children read, learning their names, listening to their laughter, and slowly, the village began to accept his presence. But Tu Tien remained the same, calm, distant, careful, as if she had built a wall so quiet that no one could see it, but no one could pass through either. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the children began to leave, Jack found himself sitting on the wooden steps, watching Tu Tien clean up alone, her hands moving quickly, efficiently, and without thinking, he stood up and walked toward her, taking the basket from her hands before she could react. She froze for a second, then looked at him, finally really looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something flicker, something familiar, but it disappeared just as quickly. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I want to." The words lingered between them, simple but heavy, and for a moment neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because both of them understood that this wasn't about helping the children or the village or even the past anymore. It was about what remained between them, fragile, damaged, but not entirely gone. Then she took the basket back from his hands, not harshly, not gently, just enough to remind him that the distance was still there. "Wanting is not the same as fixing," she said, and turned away, walking toward the small house where their son was already waiting, leaving Jack standing alone under the fading light, holding on to the one thing he had left, time, and hoping that if he stayed long enough, worked hard enough, showed up enough, maybe, just maybe, she would look at him the way she used to again. The rain came without warning, heavy and relentless, turning the narrow dirt paths of the village into slippery streams of mud, and Jack was already halfway up the hill when he heard the shout, sharp, panicked, cutting through the sound of water hitting rooftops. And before he could think, he was running, his shoes sinking into the ground, his breath uneven, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in a long time, because it wasn't just a voice calling for help. It was her voice. "Tien!" he called out instinctively, but the only answer was another cry, closer now, more desperate. And when he reached the small schoolyard, the scene hit him all at once. Children huddled under the roof, some crying, some calling out, and near the broken steps, Tu Tien was kneeling in the mud, holding their son tightly against her chest, his small body trembling, his face pale, his breathing uneven. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped to his knees beside them, his hands immediately moving to check the boy's forehead, his pulse, anything he could hold on to that felt like control. "What happened?" His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. "He slipped," Tu Tien said quickly, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. "He hit his head. He won't stop shaking." And for the first time since Jack had returned, she didn't look away from him, didn't keep her distance, because in that moment, there was no space for pride or pain, only fear. "We need to get him down the mountain," Jack said immediately, lifting the child into his arms with care, his movements quick but controlled, and without waiting for an answer, he stood, turning toward the path. "Stay close to me," he added, and she followed without question. The rain made everything harder, each step uncertain, the ground unstable, but Jack didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, because the small weight in his arms was everything, and every second mattered, and behind him, Tu Tien stumbled once, then again, until finally her hand reached forward and grabbed onto his shirt, holding on tightly, not just to keep her balance, but because somewhere deep inside she knew this was the man she had once trusted with everything. "Jack," she whispered, barely audible under the rain, and he didn't turn, didn't say anything, but his grip on their son tightened slightly, as if that alone was his answer. By the time they reached the small clinic at the edge of the village, both of them were soaked, breathless, covered in mud, and the doctor rushed them inside immediately, taking the boy from Jack's arms and placing him on the bed, checking his head, his breathing, his eyes, while Jack and Tu Tien stood side by side, closer than they had been in weeks, both silent, both watching, both holding on to the same fragile hope. "He's going to be okay," the doctor said after what felt like forever. "Just a mild concussion, but he needs rest." And the tension in the room broke instantly, Tu Tien's knees giving out as she sat down beside the bed, her hand covering her mouth as tears finally spilled over. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet relief. And Jack stood there for a second longer before slowly lowering himself beside her, his hand hovering for a moment before finally resting on her shoulder. And this time, she didn't move away. The silence between them returned, but it wasn't the same. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was softer, like something that had been broken but not completely lost. "You shouldn't have come back," she said after a while, her voice low, her eyes still on their son. Jack let out a quiet breath. "I know," he replied, "but I did." She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the truth without fully accepting it. "And now?" she asked. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, at the tiredness in her eyes, at the strength she had built without him, at the distance that was still there but no longer as sharp as before. "Now I stay," he said. The words were simple, but they didn't sound like a promise. They sounded like a decision. Tu Tian didn't respond immediately because she had heard promises before, had believed in them, had built her life around them, only to watch them fall apart. But this time, this felt different, not because of what he said, but because of what he had done. He showed up. He stayed. He carried their son through the storm without hesitation. "Staying is not enough," she said finally. Jack nodded. "I know." A small pause, then, "So I'll earn it." The words settled quietly between them, not demanding, not forcing, just there, waiting. Their son stirred slightly, his small hand reaching out unconsciously, and both of them reacted at the same time, their hands meeting again above his, and this time, neither of them pulled away, because in that moment, they weren't thinking about the past or the pain or the distance. They were thinking about him, about what they still had, about what they could still be. Outside, the rain began to fade, the sky slowly clearing, and inside the small clinic, something else began to shift. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough for her to stop looking at him like a stranger, enough for him to believe he still had a chance. And as the first light broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the room, Tu Tian finally leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing against his. Not by accident, not by mistake, but by choice. And Jack didn't move, didn't speak, because he understood that this small moment, this quiet closeness, was more important than anything he could say. The past was still there, the pain hadn't disappeared, the trust hadn't fully returned, but something had changed, something real, something fragile, something worth holding on to. And for the first time since he had come back, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't something you lost. It was something you had to find again, one moment at a time,